Welcome to Tales by Tochi. These stories are real, unique and exceptional because they are from personal experiences around the African culture. Don't forget to like, subscribe and turn on post notifications so that you will enjoy and learn from these amazing stories. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. Daniel's day always began before the sun rose, long before the chirping of birds broke the silence of the estate. While the rest of the Williams mansion slept beneath embroidered sheets and golden chandeliers, he was already up, scrubbing the marble floors of the grand hallway that led to Chief Williams' study. At only 17, Daniel had grown into a lean figure with rough hands hardened by endless labor and a back bent by the burdens of servitude. His world was the servant quarters, the kitchen, the laundry room, and the garden. Never the lavish dining rooms or plush sitting areas reserved for the elite. He had no idea what it felt like to sit on a leather couch or sip from fine porcelain. His clothes were always second-hand, faded and stitched with care by the elderly cook, Mama Rose. And yet he never once complained. The pain, the silence, the exhaustion, it had all become second nature to him. A silent rhythm of existence he couldn't afford to question. But nothing cut deeper than the cold stares and condescension he received from Brian, the chief's son, his age mate and polar opposite. Brian lived as royalty, adorned with the latest clothes, gadgets and every possible comfort life could offer. He was sharp-tongued, cruel, and always looking for new ways to humiliate Daniel. Whenever guests came to the mansion, Brian made sure Daniel was nearby, not to help but to serve as entertainment. He would spill drinks on him and then shout about clumsiness, or throw his shoe at Daniel just to make him crawl after it. The worst part was that no one stopped him. The staff turned away in silence and the chief often laughed, calling it boys being boys. Daniel would swallow his pride, eyes low, fists clenched inside his pockets. There were times when tears burned his eyes, but he would wait until nightfall to release them under the stars, away from the judgmental glares of the world. His pain was private, tucked away in the folds of darkness, where only the moon bore witness. Every corner of the mansion reminded Daniel of how little he meant. The portraits on the walls showed Brian as a toddler, as a boy in his first suit, as a teenager standing beside his proud father during public events. There were no pictures of Daniel, not even in the servants' quarters. It was as if he didn't exist beyond the chores. And yet, despite the relentless cruelty, Daniel harbored no bitterness. Somewhere deep inside him, he believed that there had to be more to life than this. A persistent feeling gnawed at him, a quiet voice whispering that he didn't belong here, that this wasn't where he was meant to be. He often stared at his reflection in the kitchen window, wondering who he truly was. But in the absence of answers, he clung to his only weapon, endurance. He knew how to survive in silence, how to find peace in quiet corners of the estate, and how to dream, if only in the hidden spaces between each back-breaking task. It was a chilly morning in mid-June when Daniel found himself carrying a crate of wine bottles up the long staircase leading to the second-floor banquet hall. The Williams family was hosting an important political figure that evening, and as always, it was the servants who bore the weight of preparation. The hall buzzed with activity, florists adjusting arrangements, chefs shouting orders, and stewards ensuring not a speck of dust clung to the velvet curtains. Amid the chaos, Daniel moved like a ghost, silent, unnoticed, and yet indispensable. He overheard snippets of conversation, praises thrown at Brian for his supposed maturity and refinement. In reality, Brian had done nothing to prepare for the evening, and yet he'd be the one toasted at the end of the night. Daniel felt a familiar ache in his chest but said nothing. He walked with his head bowed, reminding himself that invisibility was safer than recognition in a world like this. Later that evening, as the guests arrived in expensive cars and were ushered into the brightly lit hall, Daniel took his usual position near the back, holding a tray of wine glasses. His uniform was slightly oversized, the collar rough against his neck, but he stood straight, determined not to let fatigue show. Brian entered in a tailored suit, his hair slicked back, laughing loudly and charming the guests with polished small talk. But when his eyes caught Daniel's, his smirk twisted cruelly. "Try not to drop anything tonight, servant boy," he whispered as he passed, loud enough for two nearby guests to hear. They chuckled politely, unsure whether to be amused or uncomfortable. Daniel felt heat rise to his face, but he kept his expression blank. The sting was not new, it was simply deeper when administered in front of strangers. As he returned to the kitchen for refills, Mama Rose placed a hand on his shoulder. She didn't speak, but the warmth of her touch was enough. It reminded him that someone still saw him. That night, after all the guests had left and the hall had been cleaned, Daniel made his way to the garden behind the mansion. It was his sanctuary, his only claim to peace in a world built on unkindness. The moon was full, casting silver light across the flower beds. Daniel sat on the stone bench beneath the jacaranda tree, his journal resting on his lap. He wrote about the night, about Brian's insults, about the silence of the other servants, and about the ache in his chest that wouldn't go away. But he also wrote about the stars, about the softness of the wind, and the strange memory that kept resurfacing in his dreams. A lullaby he didn't recognize, sung by a voice he couldn't name. He didn't understand it, but it felt like home. Closing his journal, Daniel looked up at the night sky and whispered, "Who am I really?" It was a question he had no answer for, but one day he knew the stars would respond. The garden was the only place where Daniel felt like he truly existed. It was tucked behind the mansion like a forgotten treasure, hidden by a wall of hibiscus hedges and shaded by towering jacaranda trees. It wasn't maintained by the official groundskeepers. Only Daniel cared for it. Every morning, before the household awoke, he would sneak out to prune the shrubs, remove dead petals, and water the thirsty soil. Over time, the space became more than just a patch of green. It was a sanctuary carved from the loneliness of his existence. No one came looking for him there. No one shouted orders or mocked his silence. It was in this quiet place that Daniel dared to dream. While he knelt beside the rose bushes, he would imagine a world where he had a family that loved him, a home that felt safe, and a name that meant something. Sometimes he closed his eyes and pictured himself walking through gates not as a servant but as a son. He never told anyone about these dreams. They were too precious, too dangerous to speak aloud. It was during one of these early mornings in the garden that something unusual happened. Daniel found a small gold pendant buried in the soil beneath the base of a sunflower stem. It was old, slightly tarnished, but the intricate design was still visible, a pair of angel wings cradling a sapphire stone. His heart skipped a beat as he turned it over and noticed a tiny inscription, "To my son, always in my heart." The handwriting was delicate and unfamiliar. Daniel stared at it, unsure why his chest suddenly felt tight. It stirred something inside him, a memory just beyond reach. He had no recollection of ever owning a pendant like this, yet it felt oddly familiar, like a whisper from a life he had forgotten. Clutching it in his hand, he sat on the garden bench, his mind racing. Was it lost by one of the guests? Or perhaps by one of the staff? But something in his heart insisted that it was more than that. The pendant didn't feel lost, it felt returned. He slipped it into the pocket of his trousers and decided not to tell anyone. It was his now. His mystery. His secret key to a locked past. That night, Daniel lay on the thin mattress in the servants' quarters, the pendant pressed against his chest beneath his shirt. His mind wandered, tracing images he couldn't explain. Flashes of a hospital room, the sound of a woman humming softly, the blurry face of a man with eyes like his. He didn't know whether they were dreams or memories. Every time he tried to concentrate, they slipped away like smoke through his fingers. He wanted answers but had no one to ask. The couple he had always called Mama and Papa worked for the Williams family all their lives, but something in him had always sensed a distance. They were kind but distant, more like caretakers than parents. Lying in the dark, Daniel realized he'd spent his whole life being defined by what others said he was. But what if they were wrong? What if he wasn't meant to be a servant? What if his life had been stolen from him before it even began? He stared at the cracked ceiling and whispered into the night, "I need to know the truth, whoever I am." 3 days after finding the pendant, Daniel was called to help set up for another celebration, this time for Brian's academic achievement. Though Brian had barely passed his recent exams, Chief Williams insisted on throwing him a party. A guest list of politicians, businessmen, and influential figures flooded the estate with laughter and clinking glasses. Daniel moved between rooms carrying trays of drinks, platters of food, and silent frustration. The garden, which had always brought peace, now felt like a distant dream as he moved under the weight of service once more. The pendant, tucked beneath his shirt, reminded him of who he might be, or who he might have been. But any trace of dignity quickly faded when he entered the main hall and locked eyes with Brian. The smug smile on Brian's face widened like a predator spotting prey. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called out, tapping his glass loudly, "before you leave tonight, I must show you the future of fine dining. A servant who can balance a tray and a shattered ego at the same time." The room fell quiet, then erupted into uncomfortable laughter. Daniel stood frozen, unsure if he should leave or stay. Brian walked up to him and poured an entire glass of red wine onto Daniel's white shirt. Gasps rippled through the crowd. "Oops," Brian chuckled. "Glamsime." The chief, sipping his drink from a corner, simply shook his head with a half-smile. "That boy is always making a mess," he said dismissively. Daniel felt the familiar sting behind his eyes, but this time it was different. Something inside him shifted, something deep and long buried. He looked around the room and saw the judgment, the laughter, the indifference. And for the first time he didn't bow his head. He didn't apologize. Instead he turned slowly, wine dripping from his shirt, and walked away in silence, leaving a stunned hush behind him. The laughter faded and whispers took its place. Brian was visibly rattled. He had expected humiliation, not defiance. Daniel didn't go to the kitchen to change or to the laundry to cry. He went straight to the garden. He sat on the stone bench beneath the jacaranda tree, the moonlight casting shadows across his stained shirt. The pendant burned warm against his skin. He pulled it out and stared at it, the sapphire glinting faintly. For the first time in his life, Daniel felt the ember of rage, not the kind that sought revenge but the kind that demanded truth. Who was he really? Why did he feel so displaced in a life that never fit? He closed his eyes and made a vow. He would find answers, no matter what it took. He would no longer accept the role others had assigned him. Something had been taken from him and he intended to reclaim it. In that moment, beneath the starlit sky and the weight of humiliation, Daniel took the first step toward uncovering the truth. A truth that would shake the foundation of the mansion that had imprisoned him all his life. The arrival of Dr. Raymond stirred little interest in the beginning. He was a tall, soft-spoken man in his early 40s, assigned as the personal physician of Chief Williams and his household. The chief's influence had recently expanded, and he had insisted on round-the-clock medical availability, not for the servants of course, but for himself and his son Brian. Dr. Raymond was efficient and observant, quickly settling into the routine of the estate. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, but when he did, his voice carried an authority born of experience. Daniel noticed him during meal deliveries or when carrying out laundry. The doctor often sat alone in the library or made early morning walks around the compound. Unlike the others, he didn't avert his eyes when Daniel passed by. Once he even thanked him for a glass of water, a gesture so rare that Daniel questioned if he'd imagined it. Dr. Raymond's presence was a quiet disruption in the rigid structure of the estate, a breath of something unfamiliar, almost human. It wasn't long before Dr. Raymond suggested a full medical screening for the household. He explained it casually one morning over breakfast with Chief Williams and Brian, citing a recent rise in inherited illnesses within wealthy families. He offered to conduct genetic screening tests, standard practice he claimed, for early detection and prevention. The chief, flattered by the idea of medical sophistication, immediately agreed and ordered all household members to participate. Even the staff? Brian had scoffed, laughing into his juice. Dr. Raymond nodded calmly. It would be medically incomplete otherwise. Genetic diseases don't discriminate. With the chief's approval, Dr. Raymond began collecting blood samples. Daniel, like the rest of the staff, complied without question. He didn't see any harm in it. It was just another request, another needle. Just another part of being invisible in a house that wasn't his. But he had no idea that his blood carried the secret of everything he had ever questioned about his life. A week passed before anything changed. Daniel went about his duties as usual, though something within him had grown heavier since the humiliation at Brian's party. He often fingered the pendant through his shirt and sat longer in the garden at night, as if waiting for answers to rise from the earth. Dr. Raymond, in the meantime, spent longer hours in his room, flipping through medical charts and hospital records. His eyes narrowed when he reviewed Daniel's results, and a single sentence in a decades-old hospital logbook made his heart stop. 2 boys. Born on the same day. One wealthy. One poor. Tags mistakenly swapped. The hospital had closed down years ago, and most records had been lost in a fire. But what remained was enough to rattle the foundations of everything Dr. Raymond thought he knew. It wasn't a hypothesis anymore. The DNA didn't lie. Daniel, the silent servant boy, shared no genetic connection to the couple who raised him. But he did share a perfect match with Chief Williams and his wife. And Brian. Brian was not the biological son of the chief at all. Dr. Raymond found himself at a crossroads, the kind where silence becomes betrayal and truth threatens to implode the very world it touches. He paced his room that night, the papers spread before him like shards of reality he didn't want to piece together. In his years of practicing medicine he had dealt with accidents, traumas, even paternity disputes, but never something so monumental. The implications were staggering. If what he had uncovered was true, then the richest man in the country had been raising another man's child while his real son had grown up in servitude under his very roof. The moral weight of the discovery pressed heavily on Dr. Raymond. He thought of Daniel's eyes, the quiet intelligence behind them, the strength masked by humility, and he thought of Brian's arrogance, his cruelty, and his entitlement. Blood didn't define worth, the doctor knew, but justice demanded truth. And Daniel, knowingly or not, deserved the truth of who he was. Carefully, Dr. Raymond arranged a private meeting with Chief Williams. It was early morning before breakfast, and the chief was alone in his study reading the news. Dr. Raymond entered with the calmness of a man carrying a hurricane in his coat pocket. "I need to speak to you about something important," he began, placing the envelope of test results on the table. Chief Williams raised an eyebrow, curious but unworried. As he flipped through the pages, his amusement turned to confusion, then to disbelief, then to a kind of stunned silence that filled the room like smoke. This can't be right," he murmured, his voice a low tremble. "There must be a mistake." But Dr. Raymond shook his head. "I triple-checked the data. The boy you call your son is not biologically related to you. But Daniel is. The hospital records support it." There was a switch. The room spun for Chief Williams. He stood slowly, hands trembling, the weight of the truth pressing on decades of ignorance. He felt a sickness rise in his throat, not just for the lie he'd lived, but for the boy he had mocked, ignored, and dismissed, his own son. News like that doesn't settle easily. It cracks foundations and splits identities wide open. Chief Williams didn't speak for several minutes. He simply stared out the window, the morning sun casting long shadows across the study floor. In his silence, Dr. Raymond spoke again, more gently this time. "You've raised another man's child for 17 years. And your own son has lived as a servant, ridiculed in the same home where he should have been cherished. I don't think he even knows." The chief's lips trembled, but he said nothing. Memories rushed through his mind. Moments with Daniel that he had dismissed, signs he had ignored, the boy's unwavering discipline, his quiet strength, the way he held himself with silent dignity. The truth didn't just break Chief Williams, it condemned him. He hadn't just missed the signs. He had actively crushed the light of his own son. And now there was no easy way to undo it. Daniel was sweeping the marble steps of the main entrance when Dr. Raymond approached him. There was a strange look in the doctor's eyes, part concern, part awe, and something else Daniel couldn't name. "Do you have a moment?" the doctor asked softly. Daniel blinked in surprise, and used to being addressed directly by anyone outside the servant hierarchy. He nodded and followed Dr. Raymond to the garden, the only place where truths could bloom without immediate suffocation. They sat in silence for a while. The jacaranda tree rustled above them, and a distant bird cried as if mourning what was about to be unearthed. Dr. Raymond took a deep breath and began to speak, not as a doctor, not as a messenger of doom, but as a man who had stumbled upon the injustice of a lifetime. He told Daniel everything. About the test results. About the hospital switch. About the records. About the chief's stunned reaction. Daniel sat motionless, his eyes wide and distant, his soul slowly unraveling the life he thought he knew. At first he didn't believe it. He couldn't. The idea was too wild, too cruel, too impossible. The son of Chief Williams? He had scrubbed those floors with bleeding hands, been spat on, kicked, humiliated. He had slept in darkness while Brian was pampered in luxury. It couldn't be true. And yet, as Dr. Raymond laid out the evidence, the pendant burned against Daniel's skin like a silent witness. "The pendant," Daniel murmured, more to himself than anyone. "It has an engraving. To my son. I found it in the garden." The doctor nodded slowly. "That might have been your mother's." Daniel felt dizzy, his mind spinning through the years like pages in a storm. He remembered how the couple who raised him never truly looked at him like a son. He remembered the dreams, the lullaby, the strange warmth he could never explain. The anger began to build in his chest, hot and sharp. Not just for what was taken from him, but for how deeply he had been made to believe he was nothing. But anger gave way to something heavier, grief. Grief for a childhood unloved, for years stolen, for a family that didn't know they were missing him. Tears slipped down his cheeks, not the quiet tears of the garden, but fierce, trembling ones. "So what now?" he asked, voice breaking. Dr. Raymond placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "Now the truth has to come to light. You deserve your name, your place, your story back." Daniel stood slowly, brushing the dust from his trousers, his expression no longer just confused, but determined. He had been denied his name, his family, his dignity. But the truth had a way of reclaiming what was lost. He turned toward the mansion that had caged him for so long and whispered the words that would carry him forward. "I'm taking my life back." The news spread through the mansion like a wildfire, not through shouts or announcements, but through whispers, quiet, sharp, and contagious. The servants noticed first. Something about Daniel had changed. He still swept the floors and carried trays, but there was a different energy in his step, a new firmness in his shoulders. He walked like someone who knew something others didn't, like a man stepping into himself. Mama Rose was the first to ask him what was wrong, her voice trembling with worry. Daniel looked into her eyes, saw the concern that had always shielded him like a second skin, and gently held her hand. "I'm not who I thought I was," he whispered. Her eyes filled with tears before he could explain more. She pulled him into a hug so tight it threatened to shatter him. Even in her confusion, she knew the truth had found him, and she feared the storm it would bring. In a house built on appearances, nothing was more dangerous than a servant who discovered he was royalty. Chief Williams had not yet told his wife. Dr. Raymond had urged him to do so before word leaked, but the chief was struggling under the weight of shame. He had always prided himself on power and discipline, on knowing everything in his domain. And now the son he had raised, the one who carried his name, was not his, while the boy he had overlooked, insulted, and barely acknowledged turned out to be his own flesh and blood. The chief's silence festered like an open wound. At night, he would sit in his study staring at Daniel's test results, replaying every interaction he had ever had with the boy, the way Daniel never fought back, the way he held his pain with grace, the way he looked more like the chief's late father than Brian ever did. But even in the face of evidence, he feared the confrontation that awaited him. His wife had worshipped Brian. The revelation would break her. But lies were already breaking the walls of their home, and the clock was ticking. Daniel, meanwhile, withdrew into the garden more often. He needed space to think, to breathe, to prepare. Dr. Raymond gave him copies of the DNA results, the hospital logs, even a faded photograph of the maternity ward where he had been born. Each piece of evidence pulled him deeper into a truth that was equal parts liberation and devastation. He had spent his life watching Brian receive love, applause, and luxury that was meant for him. But now that the truth was his, he didn't feel vindicated. He felt hollow. He didn't want to be a prince in a kingdom that had treated him like dirt. He didn't want riches that came soaked in years of neglect. What he wanted, what he had always wanted, was to be seen, to be valued, to be loved not for a name but for who he was. And now that the truth was unraveling everything, Daniel wondered if he could ever truly find peace again. It was a cool, windless evening when Chief Williams finally summoned Daniel to the study. The boy entered slowly, wiping his hands on his apron, though his heart beat louder than any footsteps on the marble floor. The chief sat behind his massive oak desk, a tumbler of brandy half finished, his eyes sunken and restless. For a moment there was silence, thick, almost choking. The chief gestured for Daniel to sit. "I suppose you know," he began quietly. Daniel nodded once. His fingers gripped the arms of the chair, but he didn't tremble. He had already cried all his tears. The chief sighed heavily, looking down at the papers between them. "I didn't believe it at first. I thought it was a mistake, some cruel joke." He took a long sip of his drink, then continued. "But I can't deny what's right in front of me. The truth is, you're my son." The words felt foreign in the air, as if neither man truly believed them yet. But they landed. Heavy. Irrevocable. Daniel didn't know how to respond. What was there to say? That he had dreamed of a moment like this while scrubbing toilets and eating leftovers from the main kitchen? That he had imagined what it would be like to hear those words, not from a stranger but from a father? But this wasn't how it was supposed to feel. The moment wasn't warm. It wasn't triumphant. It was awkward and raw and cold. "And Brian?" Daniel asked finally, his voice steady. Chief Williams flinched. "He doesn't know. Not yet. And he won't take it well." That they both knew was an understatement. "He's still my son in every way I know. I raised him." The chief looked up then, his gaze watery. "But I failed you. I failed you worse than I've ever failed anyone." For the first time, Daniel saw him not as a man of wealth and authority, but as a father mourning a lifetime of blindness. "You didn't just fail me," Daniel said quietly. "You taught everyone else in this house to do the same." The silence that followed was louder than any argument. Chief Williams nodded slowly, his pride breaking with every second. "What do you want, Daniel? A seat at the table? Your name in the will? I'll give it. Everything. You deserve more than I could ever repay." But Daniel shook his head. "I don't want your guilt, or your money. I want to know why no one ever looked at me and saw the truth. Why I had to find out from a doctor, instead of from a father who should have felt it in his bones." The chief stood slowly, walking to the window. "Because I never looked. and I have to live with that. Daniel stood too, the conversation closing like a wound that would never fully heal. I need time, he said softly. This doesn't fix anything. But maybe it starts something new. Then he walked out, leaving the chief alone in the shadows of the room where truth had finally come to claim him. Brian burst into the study the next day, his voice a storm of confusion and fury. Is it true? He yelled, holding the printed DNA report someone had slipped under his door. You lied to me? All these years? Chief Williams stood by the fireplace unmoved. His face had aged 10 years overnight. I was going to tell you, Brian, he said softly. But I needed to find the right words. Brian slammed the papers on the desk. You don't get to soften this. You raised me as your son and now suddenly I'm nothing? Some mistake? And that, he pointed toward the window where Daniel had just walked past. That servant is your real son? His voice cracked, rage twisting his features. The chief remained calm, though his shoulders were heavy. You will always be my son in the ways that count. But the truth is the truth. Daniel was switched at birth. He is my blood. Brian laughed bitterly. So what? You're going to hand everything over to him now? Just throw me away like I never mattered? No one's being thrown away, the chief replied. But you have to accept this. Daniel didn't ask for any of this. He's just as much a victim as you are. Brian's eyes were red, not just from rage but from fear. He had built his identity on being the heir, the golden boy, the one destined to inherit the empire. Without that, who was he? You don't understand, Brian hissed. You're destroying everything. The chief took a step forward. You destroyed yourself, Brian. With your arrogance. Your cruelty. You treated Daniel like dirt, and he still has more integrity in one hand than you have in your whole body. The words hit like a slap. Brian recoiled, stunned. His father had never spoken to him like that before. For the first time he saw not just disappointment in his father's eyes, but disgust. And it shook him. If you walk out that door angry, Brian, don't expect the world to bend for you like it used to, the chief warned. The truth doesn't care who you were pretending to be. Brian stormed out without another word. He passed Daniel in the hallway, their eyes locking for a tense moment. There was no smugness in Daniel's gaze, only sadness. Brian couldn't stand it. He shoved past him and disappeared down the corridor. Daniel exhaled, the tension settling like dust on his shoulders. He hadn't asked for Brian's hatred. He hadn't asked for any of this. Yet here he was, standing at the heart of a life that had once belonged to someone else. As he walked toward the garden, Daniel realized that the truth, though powerful, didn't heal on its own. It needed time, choices, and courage. And the boy who had once been a servant was now being asked to become something entirely different. Not just a son, but a man worthy of the legacy he never knew he had. Brian disappeared for 2 days. No one in the house knew where he went and no one dared ask. The mansion felt different in his absence, quieter but tense, like a storm had passed and left behind uncertain skies. Daniel continued his duties, though the lines between servant and heir were now blurred beyond repair. Some of the staff began treating him with subtle deference, opening doors for him, greeting him with hesitant smiles, but Daniel didn't bask in it. He wasn't sure who he was yet, and until he figured it out, the attention felt like another costume being forced on him. Meanwhile, Chief Williams became increasingly withdrawn. He spent more time in his study, making late-night calls and reviewing legal documents. The shift in the household hierarchy had begun, but it wasn't a clean transition. There were still wounds, raw, open, and deep, and none more volatile than the one inside Brian, festering with betrayal. When Brian returned on the 3rd day, his appearance startled everyone. His shirt was wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot, and the smell of alcohol clung to him like a second skin. He stormed into the mansion, slamming the front door behind him and demanding to speak with his father. The confrontation was loud, filled with curses and accusations. Brian felt robbed, not just of his inheritance but of his identity. Everything he had ever believed about himself had been built on a lie. You gave him my life, he shouted, his voice echoing through the halls. You took everything from me and handed it to a servant. Chief Williams stood calmly, but his eyes betrayed fatigue. It was never yours to begin with, he said quietly. That one sentence lit a fire in Brian. He threw a vase against the wall, shards scattering across the floor. He doesn't deserve it. Brian growled. He's not like us, he doesn't belong here. The chief didn't flinch. He belongs more than you do. He has humility, character. You've never had to earn a thing. Daniel watched it all from the top of the stairs, unseen. The shouting cut through him like a knife, not because he feared Brian's anger but because he understood it. Brian wasn't just angry, he was scared. He had lived his entire life in the spotlight, never having to wonder if he belonged. Now, everything had changed, and Daniel had become a mirror reflecting everything Brian was not. Still, Daniel felt no satisfaction. This wasn't justice, it was heartbreak. When Brian saw him, he pointed an accusatory finger. "This isn't over," he hissed. "You think this house is yours now? You think they'll ever see you as one of them?" Daniel didn't answer. He didn't have to. His silence was no longer submission, it was strength. Brian stormed off again, and this time no one followed him. For the first time he had isolated himself not through power but through weakness. And Daniel, the forgotten boy once mocked by the son of the house, was finally standing in a truth no one could take away. It began as a leak, a small blog post from a freelance journalist who had overheard the mansion drama through a distant relative on the staff. Heir to billionaire Chief Williams discovered to be servant boy switched at birth. The headline spread like wildfire. Within 24 hours, it had been picked up by national media outlets, and Daniel's face, once invisible even inside the walls he cleaned, was now plastered across TV screens, newspaper covers, and social media feeds. The story had everything: wealth, betrayal, identity, injustice. It captivated a country hungry for drama. Some sympathized with Daniel, hailing him as a symbol of resilience. Others criticized the chief, accusing him of negligence. And some ridiculed Brian, calling him a spoiled fraud. The Williams estate quickly became a fortress, with reporters camped outside and drones circling overhead. Daniel couldn't take a step outside without being photographed. The world he had hidden in for 17 years had cracked wide open, and there was no going back. Inside the mansion, tension stretched like wire. Chief Williams called for emergency meetings with lawyers and PR specialists. His empire was built on public image, and the scandal threatened everything. Meanwhile, Daniel found himself suffocating beneath a new weight, not the burden of servitude but the pressure of public scrutiny. He wasn't used to being seen, let alone celebrated or dissected by strangers. He received letters, gifts, even proposals from people who claimed to be long-lost relatives. But none of it felt real. It was noise, loud and unrelenting. The only place where he found solace was still the garden. One night, he escaped to the bench beneath the jacaranda tree and stared up at the sky. The stars were unchanged. In a world where his name, his role, and his future were suddenly shifting, the night sky remained his only constant. He closed his eyes and whispered a prayer, not for fame, not for fortune, but for peace, for clarity, for guidance on what to do next. The chief eventually made a public statement. Standing at a press podium with his wife beside him and Daniel in the background, he confirmed the DNA results and acknowledged the hospital switch. Mistakes were made. Lives were affected. But the truth has come to light, and we are working to make it right. His voice was steady, rehearsed. Brian was nowhere to be found. The reporters shouted questions about inheritance, lawsuits, and Daniel's future. Daniel didn't answer any of them. He simply stood there, the pendant his only armor, his silence a shield. When it was over, he returned inside without speaking to anyone. He passed the hallway where he used to sweep the floor, now waxed to a mirror shine, and stared at his own reflection. He saw not a servant, not a victim, not even a hero. Just a boy trying to find his place in a world that had rewritten his story without asking. And somewhere deep inside he knew this was just the beginning. Chief Williams sat alone in his study, the soft hum of the air conditioner the only sound in the silence that had taken over his world. For years he had ruled this mansion, this empire, with the confidence of a man who believed he knew everything. Now he realized he had known nothing. He had been blind, not just to Daniel's true identity, but to the kind of man his so-called son had become. The public had turned. Shareholders were nervous. His wife cried herself to sleep at night. But the worst of it, the part that gnawed at his soul, was Daniel. The boy had never demanded anything. No threats. No lawsuits. Not even anger. Just a quiet dignity that made the chief feel smaller every time they crossed paths. He had failed him. Not once but repeatedly. Every insult, every moment of silence, every time he looked past Daniel to praise Brian instead, it played in his mind like a cruel film reel. And there was no rewind. He finally asked Daniel to join him for dinner, just the two of them. It was awkward at first, the table too large, the silence too loud. The chief cleared his throat. "I owe you more than I can say," he began. "But I want to start by saying I'm sorry." Daniel looked up, guarded. "Sorry doesn't change what happened." The chief nodded. "I know. But I need you to hear it anyway. I was blind. I let the way you came into this world define who you were. I let a mistake make me cruel. Daniel said nothing. The chief continued. You remind me of my father. He was a strong man. Honest. Quiet but wise. You have his eyes. The compliment caught Daniel off guard. He wasn't used to kindness from this man, let alone admiration. I don't know what's supposed to happen now, Daniel admitted. I don't even know who I am yet. The chief reached across the table. Then let's figure it out together. As father and son. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation. Wounds that deep don't heal in one night. But it was a beginning. Over the next few days, the chief introduced Daniel to parts of the estate he'd never seen. The boardroom, the family library, even a photo album filled with images of Daniel as a baby that had never been given to the right parents. Each moment chipped away at the wall between them. The chief began correcting people when they addressed Daniel as a servant. That's my son, he would say. And slowly the mansion adjusted. The staff whispered less. The guests stared less. And Daniel, while still unsure of who he would become, began to feel something new stirring in his heart. Not confidence, not pride, but possibility. For the first time he was being seen. Not as the help. Not as a scandal. But as a person. A son. A soul finally coming home to where he belonged. The days that followed felt like a delicate balancing act for Daniel. Though his status had changed dramatically in the eyes of the household and the world, inside he still felt like the boy who had cleaned floors with calloused hands and slept on a creaky cot in the servants' quarters. Now he was being fitted for tailored suits, invited to meetings with business executives, and asked to give interviews to media outlets. His wardrobe changed, his room was moved to one of the mansion's guest wings, and an assistant was assigned to help him navigate this new life. But none of it felt like it belonged to him. He looked into the mirror one morning, dressed in a custom navy blue blazer, and didn't recognize the person staring back. Who is this? He whispered. The reflection had his eyes, his scars, but none of his truth. The life he had longed for wasn't the problem. It was the emptiness it carried when built on years of silence and loss. The mansion that had once suffocated him with labor now threatened to do so with luxury. Daniel found himself returning to the neighborhood where he'd grown up, the part of town where cracked pavements and leaking roofs were normal, where the air carried the scent of charcoal fires and distant laughter. He walked past the corner store where he used to fetch bread for Mama Rose, past the school he'd only attended for a few years before being pulled into full-time service. It was here that he visited the only parents he had ever known, the couple who had raised him, fed him, disciplined him, and taught him how to endure. They stood frozen when he knocked on the door, unsure whether to greet him or bow. Don't, Daniel said softly. Don't look at me like I'm not your child. His mother burst into tears, and his father's hands trembled as he invited Daniel inside. The house was small, warm, and exactly how he remembered it. He sat in the same chair by the window and listened to them explain what they had never dared say before. They had always suspected something was wrong, the way hospital staff looked confused, the way Daniel never resembled either of them. But fear and poverty kept them quiet. They had chosen love over questions. Daniel didn't feel anger. He felt a strange mixture of sadness and understanding. His adopted parents had made mistakes, yes, but they had loved him in the only way they knew how. You may not be my blood, his mother whispered, but you're my son. Those words wrapped around Daniel like a bomb, soothing the fractured identity that had haunted him since the truth came out. He realized then that identity wasn't just about bloodlines or birthrights, it was also about memories, choices, and the people who stood by you when the world didn't. As he left that house and looked back one last time, Daniel understood that his past hadn't been erased. It had been reshaped. And if he was going to build a new future, he would have to carry both families with him, the one who raised him and the one who had just found him. Back at the mansion, Daniel's return from his old neighborhood marked a turning point in his heart. He realized that he had the rare chance to build bridges instead of burning them. So much had been taken from him, yes, but he was still standing. And more than that, he now had something many people didn't: power. Not the kind that crushes others, but the kind that heals. It began with small acts. He requested that the servants be given better meals and longer rest periods. He asked for repairs in the servant quarters. He even sat down with Mama Rose and asked her to share ideas on how the household could be improved. She wept when he did. You're still our boy, she said. You haven't forgotten. That was what mattered most to Daniel. That despite his new title, he didn't forget the hands that had wiped his tears, the voices that had whispered hope into his ears when the world called him worthless. Then came the hardest part, facing Brian. The former heir had become a recluse, holed up in a private apartment downtown, refusing to speak to the media, the staff, or even his own parents. His friends had distanced themselves. His future was uncertain. And while some in the public delighted in his fall from grace, Daniel didn't. He knew what it was like to feel lost, angry, rejected. So he reached out, not with vengeance but with grace. Brian refused at first. But Daniel persisted, sending a letter instead of a demand. In it he wrote, "You may have had a life that wasn't yours to begin with, but that doesn't mean you don't matter. We were both victims of a mistake neither of us made. I'm not asking for a relationship. I'm asking for a chance to make peace with the only brother I've ever known." Days passed without a reply. Then one afternoon Brian showed up at the garden gate, unshaven, eyes heavy with regret. They sat together in silence beneath the jacaranda tree. It wasn't like old times, it was something completely new. Brian looked down at his hands, then at Daniel. "I hated you," he confessed, "because I thought you were taking everything from me. But I see now, you never had anything to begin with. And I had everything." Daniel nodded. "And what did either of us really win?" Brian let out a dry laugh. "Pain. Guilt. Confusion. There were no apologies, not yet. But there was something better. Honesty. Vulnerability. The kind that cracks open the heart and lets light in." They sat for hours talking not just about the past but about what could come next. Daniel didn't expect them to become best friends. But he hoped perhaps they could become better men. And for the first time Brian seemed willing to try. Forgiveness, Daniel realized, wasn't about erasing the hurt. It was about freeing yourself from it. And that freedom tasted like peace. While Daniel rose in quiet strength, Brian's fall had been public, loud, and painful. Stripped of the identity he'd built his life upon, he spiraled into the depths of recklessness. The media dubbed him the imposter heir, and though the label was harsh, it stuck. Investors pulled out of his projects. Invitations to high society events dried up. He had grown so used to adoration that he didn't know who he was without it. He turned to parties, late-night bar crawls, and friends who only stayed close as long as the money flowed. But the money didn't last. Chief Williams had cut off financial privileges, not to punish Brian, but to force him to face the world without a cushion. Brian cursed his father, cursed Daniel, and cursed fate. But deep down even he knew the truth. He had been given the world and failed to handle it with grace. Now all he had left was a choice, to sink further into bitterness, or to rise into something he had never tried to be, authentic. His meeting with Daniel had left a mark. He hated how calm Daniel was, how grounded. It made Brian feel even more unstable. But the letter, the garden, the conversation, they lingered. He remembered moments from childhood when Daniel, even as a servant, had stood by him during moments of fear. When Brian had broken a vase and Daniel took the blame. When he had a fever and Daniel brought him water without being asked. And yet, Brian had repaid that quiet loyalty with cruelty. It sickened him now. He began seeing a therapist, something he'd once scoffed at. He stopped drinking. He reached out to the chief not to beg but to speak. "I want to earn my place back," he told his father. "Not as your heir. Just as your son." The chief didn't embrace him immediately. But he didn't turn him away either. For the first time, Brian began the work of becoming someone better, not because he had to but because he finally wanted to. Daniel watched all of this unfold from a distance. He didn't interfere. He didn't celebrate Brian's fall or rush to mend every broken piece. Instead he focused on what he could control, his own path. He began attending business training sessions with the chief's advisors. He shadowed board meetings. He asked questions, listened intently, and applied everything he had learned from years of observing silently. He didn't want to inherit the empire out of pity, he wanted to be worthy of it. And as Brian quietly rebuilt himself in the background, and the chief slowly began to treat Daniel as an equal, the Williams household began to feel like a place of healing rather than performance. The world outside still whispered, still speculated. But inside those walls, a new story was being written. One not born of wealth or power but of truth, redemption, and second chances. Daniel's first time stepping into the boardroom wasn't as grand as he had once imagined. The room, long and rectangular, was lined with polished mahogany walls, a chandelier hanging above a long glass table where men and women in tailored suits sat with their tablets and notepads, discussing millions as casually as the weather. He walked in quietly beside Chief Williams, dressed in a simple gray suit, his posture tall but modest. There were sideways glances, whispers masked as coughs, and a few furrowed brows. Most of the board members had seen the headlines. Some knew him only as the former servant. Others had only heard whispers about the switch. But now he was here, seated at the right hand of the man whose blood flowed through his veins, whose legacy he had unknowingly served for most of his life. Chief Williams cleared his throat and stood. Gentlemen, ladies, you've all heard the rumors. Let me confirm what's true. Daniel is my biological son. He has joined this board, not as a favor but as the rightful heir to my position. I expect the same respect toward him as you've given me. The room fell silent. No objections. Just stunned acknowledgement. Despite the weight of that moment, Daniel didn't speak much during that first meeting. He observed more than he contributed, taking notes as each department gave updates on finances, operations and legal matters. But his silence wasn't weakness, it was focused strategy. He listened deeply, reading the subtle cues between executives, understanding who carried influence and who merely followed. After the meeting, he stayed behind and asked to review the company's corporate social responsibility plans. It was a surprise to most. They expected him to on power, on money, but instead he was interested in impact. If we're the largest employer in the country, shouldn't we be investing in the communities we pull resources from? He asked. The room had no immediate answers. Over the following weeks, Daniel worked with consultants and advisors to design a new initiative: scholarships for low-income children, better housing for factory workers, and a mentorship program for young entrepreneurs. It wasn't a marketing move. It was personal. He wanted others like him to have chances he never did. As the weeks passed, the staff within the company began to see Daniel not as an outsider, but as someone born to lead. His ideas were sharp, his intentions genuine, and his energy tireless. He arrived early, left late, and treated every employee with dignity, from the janitors to the senior executives. There were moments of doubt, of course. Some board members questioned his lack of experience. Others feared his changes would affect profit margins. But Chief Williams stood firm. Give him time, he said. You'll see. And they did. Under Daniel's influence, employee satisfaction rose. Public approval of the company skyrocketed. The media began to focus less on the scandal and more on the young man reshaping a legacy. Slowly but surely, Daniel transformed from a headline into a leader. And while he still visited the garden each evening to find peace under the jacaranda tree, he no longer looked up at the stars for answers. He had become the answer, living proof that strength can rise from the most forgotten places. It was during a visit to a public school in one of the poorest regions of the country that Daniel found the spark for something greater. He had gone there with his new foundation team to assess needs: books, supplies, uniforms. But what struck him most was a conversation with a boy named Tolu. He was 10 years old, barefoot, with eyes that carried the same quiet fire Daniel had once seen in his own reflection. Sir, the boy asked shyly, is it true you used to clean floors before becoming rich? Daniel smiled and knelt beside him. Yes, he said. And I never forgot how it felt. The boy's eyes widened. Then maybe I can do it too. That moment, that pure flicker of hope, reminded Daniel why he had chosen this path. He wasn't building legacy for titles or glory. He was building it for children like Tolu, for every servant child, every orphan, every overlooked soul with untapped brilliance. He returned to the mansion with a vision: to launch the Forgotten Seed Initiative, a national foundation aimed at empowering disadvantaged youth through education, mentorship, and mental health support. The foundation launched with quiet strength. No flashy celebrity endorsements. No red carpets. Just Daniel, standing before a modest crowd in a renovated community center, announcing the birth of a dream. I was once invisible, he told them. Not because I lacked value but because no one ever looked deep enough. This foundation exists to remind every forgotten soul that you are seen, and you are capable. Donations poured in, not just from wealthy allies, but from ordinary citizens who resonated with his story. Schools were adopted. Scholarships were granted. Libraries were stocked. And Daniel became more than just the heir to a fortune. He became a symbol. A story that parents told their children. A reason to hope. Even Chief Williams, once skeptical of such pursuits, admitted one night, "You've done more in a year than I managed in a decade." It wasn't flattery. It was a father acknowledging the greatness of a son he nearly lost. Still, Daniel kept his heart grounded. He returned to the servant quarters often, not to boast but to remember. He sat with Mama Rose, helped cook meals, and played chess with the older stewards. The same hands that once scrubbed grime now signed policy documents. But they never forgot how to serve. That was his strength. That was his legacy. He knew the empire he would one day inherit could easily corrupt if he let it. But he also knew he carried something rare, A memory of what it meant to have nothing and a promise to never let others go unseen. His story had started with a mistake, but he was determined to end it with purpose. He was no longer just the boy in the background. He was Daniel Williams, the son, the servant, the seed, and now the sower of futures yet to bloom. One evening, after a long day of meetings and school visits, Daniel found himself seated beside Chief Williams in the library. The old man looked tired, not just physically but emotionally. Running an empire for decades had hardened him, but recent events had chipped away at the shell. The room was quiet, filled with the scent of old books and the flicker of firelight. Chief Williams sipped a glass of whiskey and gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit with me," he said. Daniel obliged, unsure of what was to come. After a long pause the chief spoke. "When you were a baby, your mother used to sing to you. Every night. You'd stop crying the second she hummed." Daniel's eyes widened. "I've heard that song in my dreams. My whole life." The chief nodded slowly. "That was her lullaby. You remembered what we forgot." Silence filled the space between them, an understanding deeper than words. Two lives once divided now trying to find their rhythm as father and son. The chief continued, his voice rough. "I want you to take over soon. Not just the company. Everything. The estate. The trust. I'm tired, Daniel. I've spent so much of my life building walls, between me and your mother, between me and Brian, between me and you. And all it gave me was regret." Daniel leaned forward, his voice calm. "Then let's stop building walls. Let's build something better." The chief smiled faintly. "You sound like your mother." It was the first time Daniel had heard that comparison, and it wrapped around him like a cloak. They spent hours in the library that night, going over documents, family history, old letters, and photographs. The chief handed him a small box containing a family crest. "This belonged to my father. Now it's yours." Daniel took it with both hands, not just accepting a legacy, but embracing it. Not with pride, but with the humility of someone who knew how much pain had paved the path to that moment. In the following weeks, father and son worked side by side. It wasn't always smooth. There were disagreements, generational differences, lingering guilt. But there was also growth. Daniel learned about his grandfather's values: honor, discipline, generosity. The chief learned about Daniel's world: resilience, empathy, innovation. Together they began to reimagine the future of the Williams legacy, not as an empire of profit but a platform for purpose. For the first time the mansion became more than a symbol of power, it became a home. A place where a forgotten boy became a beloved son. And as Daniel stood beside his father at an annual gala, now recognized by all as the true heir, he felt no bitterness, no anger, only peace. The past had shaped him, but it no longer defined him. He was ready for the final step. The one that would close the circle of pain and begin the story of healing. The garden was in full bloom. The jacaranda tree had shed its violet blossoms across the ground like a royal carpet. The roses blushed in reds and pinks, and the air was thick with the scent of lavender and earth. It was the same garden where Daniel had once hidden, knelt, cried, and dreamed. But now it was transformed, not in its appearance but in its meaning. Today it wasn't a place of escape. It was a place of celebration. Chairs were arranged in neat rows under the canopy of trees. Guests, family, friends, employees, schoolchildren, gathered, all dressed in warm colors, each carrying a flower to plant. At the center stood Daniel, tall and serene, dressed in a white native agbada embroidered with gold, a subtle nod to both his humble past and his royal future. This wasn't a coronation, nor was it a corporate event. It was something deeper. A dedication. A ceremony marking the beginning of a new chapter. One where legacy, love, and identity were no longer at war. Beside him stood Chief Williams, older now but lighter, like a man finally freed from the burden of pretending. His wife, Daniel's mother, held his arm tightly, her face tear-streaked but glowing. Brian was there too, seated in the front row, quiet but no longer sullen. He had grown too, his journey slower, more private but no less important. The once spoiled heir now worked with the Forgotten Seed initiative, helping young men transition out of juvenile homes and into apprenticeships. The media was present but distant, as Daniel had requested. This was not a day for headlines. It was a day for healing. Mama Rose sat near the front, clutching a bouquet she'd grown herself. When Daniel's eyes met hers, they shared a silent moment, a thank you wrapped in 20 years of unspoken love. He stepped forward, cleared his throat, and addressed the gathering. "This garden," he said, voice steady, "was once my only refuge. It was where I dreamed, questioned, and hoped. It's where I found a pendant that led me to the truth. And it's where I found myself. Today we make it a place for all those still searching. He knelt by the jacaranda tree, dug a small hole in the earth, and placed a polished stone plaque into it. The words were simple: for the forgotten who will never be unseen again. One by one the guests came forward, planting their flowers around the plaque. As the colors formed a living tapestry of unity, Daniel stood, his heart full. He turned to face the mansion, its windows glowing with the light of dusk. Once a fortress of pain, it was now a beacon of redemption. He felt the weight of his life, not as a burden but as a crown. Not made of gold but of experience. He thought of all he had endured, the lies, the cruelty, the loneliness. And yet here he stood, not bitter, not broken, but whole. As the final flower was planted, and the sun dipped below the horizon, Daniel closed his eyes and whispered, "I am home." And for the first time it wasn't just true, it was complete. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment and subscribe to my YouTube channel Divine Stories for more.